Welcome to module number 2 of IAS number 20. In this second module, we are going to explain the recognition of the government grants. Before recognizing a government grant, entities must ensure that they meet the eligibility criteria outlined in IAS number 20. These criteria typically involve certain conditions that the entity must fulfill in order to qualify for the grant recognition. Now, let's discuss these criteria. The first one is related to the identification of the eligibility criteria. Entities need to identify the specific eligibility criteria and the conditions set by the government for each grant. So, for example, if the government gives the entity a grant in order to purchase an asset and use it for the next 5 years, so this would be considered a condition here in order to be eligible to receive the grant and continue with having the grant and not return it to the government. The second condition related to the recognition of the grant is related to the documentation and proving the evidence that the entity deserves receiving the grant. And this documentation and evidence is related to the entity's compliance with the eligibility condition in order to receive the grant and keeping on having the grant in their records. So as an example, imagine a research institute seeking a government grant to fund a groundbreaking scientific project. The eligibility conditions may include milestones related to the project goals, the involvement of qualified researchers, and adherence to ethical standards. The institute must carefully document its compliance with these conditions. In addition to meeting the eligibility criteria, entities are required to assess and provide reasonable assurance that they will comply with the conditions attached to the government grant. Now, let's explore this further. Ongoing compliance monitoring means that entities should establish systems to monitor the ongoing compliance with the grant conditions throughout the period of the grant. So, for example, if the grant given by the government sets a condition to increase the production capacity by 20% each year, so the entities must provide the documentation that it comply with this condition each year, which means that it increases the production capacity by 20% each year. So this compliance means that the entity will continue having the grant in their record and the government will not ask the entity to return this grant to the government again. Next is related to the materiality consideration. So the assessment here should consider the materiality of the non-compliance. If the entity will not comply and the non-compliance is likely, so the entity may need to reassess the recognition of the grant. So as an example, let's consider a construction company that receives a government grant in order to build affordable housing to the citizen in the country. So to assess the reasonable assurance of the compliance, the company sets up internal control system in order to monitor the use of the funds and monitor the construction progress and the adherence to the project timelines, which means that regular audits are conducted in order to ensure the ongoing compliance. Another example, consider a technology startup that initially qualifies for a government grant based on certain criteria. However, as the industry evolves, the regulatory environment will change, correct? And the startup must adapt its operation to continue meeting the eligibility conditions. So, to sum up, recognizing the government grant involves meeting two conditions. Number one, the eligibility criteria. Number two, assessing reasonable assurance of the compliance with the grant conditions. So, entities need to carefully document their eligibility and establish internal control system or even a monitoring system in order to measure the compliance with the conditions of the grant and adapt to the changing conditions. In the next module, we are going to explore the initial recognition of the government grant and the related accounting considerations. Stay engaged for more practical insights.